At 5:10 a.m., my husband walked into the house with his mistress and said, "Divorce me. Look at yourself. What do you even have left that I need?" The woman behind him opened my refrigerator and smiled softly. Smart women know when their value has run its course. Meanwhile, I was still sitting on the cold kitchen floor holding our feverish baby after an entire sleepless night. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I simply picked up my son, grabbed the suitcase I had already packed, and walked away. Behind me, I heard the soft pop of a champagne cork, but neither of them realized that what was waiting for them would be far worse. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. It genuinely means something. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country. I love knowing who is on the other side of the screen. A quick note, this story contains fictional elements crafted for reflection and education. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but everything it says to your heart is entirely intentional. The door didn't just open. It swung wide, pulling in a gust of January air that reached me even on the kitchen floor, cold enough to raise the hair on my arms, sharp enough to cut through the smell of coffee I had made 3 hours ago and never touched. I had been sitting with my back against the refrigerator, Finn cradled against my chest. He had finally settled, his breathing slower now, the worst of the fever breaking sometime around 4. His small weight against me was the only warm thing in the room. I didn't move when I heard the footsteps. There were 2 sets. One, I recognized the particular rhythm of Donovan's dress shoes on hardwood, the way the left heel struck slightly harder than the right. The other was lighter, deliberate, the kind of footsteps that belong to someone who has practiced entering a room. Donovan Harmon. My husband of 3 years walked into the kitchen without looking at me. He was still in his suit from the previous day, jacket unbuttoned, tie pulled loose at the collar. He looked the way he always looked when he came home late, not tired exactly, but somewhere else, as though the part of him that lived in this house had already checked out long before his body followed. Behind him came a woman I had seen exactly twice before, both times at company events, where she had been introduced as his executive assistant. Sabrina Voss was somewhere in her early 30s, dark-haired, dressed in a silk slip that had no business being worn in January. She had Donovan's suit jacket draped over her shoulders, and she walked into my kitchen the way someone walks into a hotel lobby, with the particular ease of a person who has already decided the space belongs to them. She opened my refrigerator, not to ask, not to hesitate. She simply reached past the handle, pulled it open, and scanned the shelves for something to drink the way you do in your own home when you've been coming and going for long enough that the habit has formed without your noticing. I watched her from the floor. Finn stirred slightly at the sound of voices. I shifted my hand to his back, pressing gently, steadily until his breathing evened out again. I did not stand up. I did not announce myself. I simply sat there on the cold marble I had selected from 3 different samples 18 months ago, and I waited to see what kind of people they were going to be. Donovan finally looked at me. It wasn't recognition exactly. It was more like recalibration, the slight adjustment a person makes when they walk into a room and find it arranged differently than they expected. His eyes moved from my face to Finn, to the phone on the floor beside me, dead now, its battery finished somewhere after the 30-second unanswered call. He did not ask about the baby. He did not ask about the fever. He loosened his tie another inch and said, "Look at yourself, Celeste." I said nothing. "You smell like sour milk and dirty diapers." His voice was flat, without heat, which was somehow worse than if he had been angry. "That smell, it's in your clothes, it's in your hair, it's everywhere in this house." He glanced around the kitchen as though confirming this, then back at me. "Sabrina manages an entire division of 43 people and still walks into a room like a woman who respects herself." Sabrina had found a bottle of sparkling water. She leaned against the counter and opened it, the cap releasing a soft hiss. She looked at me with the particular expression of someone watching a situation they have already decided the outcome of. Smart women know when their value has run its course. Her tone was conversational, almost kind, which made it land harder than cruelty would have. Donovan needs someone who can stand beside him at events, who can hold a room, not someone who— She paused, glancing at Finn. "Handles the domestic side of things." "The domestic side of things." I thought about the 32 calls I had made the previous night while Finn's temperature climbed to 102. I thought about the 15 months I had spent keeping every corner of this house running while Donovan built the version of his career that he now apparently needed a different woman to stand beside. I thought about the way Sabrina had opened my refrigerator without asking, and how that single gesture told me more about what had been happening than anything either of them had said. I looked down at Finn. His eyelashes were resting against his cheek, dark and still. His fingers had loosened their grip on my shirt. Then I stood up. I carried him to the bassinet near the kitchen window and laid him down with both hands, taking my time making sure he was settled before I let go. He made a small sound but did not wake. I smoothed the blanket over him once. Then I walked to the kitchen table. The divorce papers had been sitting there since Donovan set them down, a clean manila folder, the kind that comes from a law office with a pen placed on top at a precise angle. I recognized the firm's name on the tab. He had been to see them at some point. He had prepared for this. I picked up the pen. I did not read the papers. I did not ask for time. What I understood about contracts was this. The one that mattered was not the one on the table. The one that mattered was already in place, handled months ago by someone far more careful than the man standing in my kitchen. I signed where the tabs indicated, closed the folder, and set the pen down beside it. Donovan stared at me. I think he had expected something else. Tears, questions, a negotiation. Some version of the woman he thought he had married, the one who smoothed things over and kept the peace and found a way to make herself smaller so everything else could fit. I went to the bedroom. The suitcase I had packed 6 days earlier was already in the closet behind my winter coats. Not a large one, just a carry-on with enough for Finn and enough for me to get through the first week without having to come back for anything. I had thought about what those first days would require. I had thought about a great many things. When I came back through the hallway, Donovan was still in the kitchen. Sabrina was sitting at the table now, in the chair I had sat in every morning for 3 years. She was looking at her phone. I lifted Finn from the bassinet without waking him, tucked him into the crook of my arm, picked up my suitcase, and walked to the front door. Celeste! Donovan's voice followed me into the hallway. Where are you going? I opened the door. The January air came in again, colder this time, or maybe I was just more aware of it. I didn't answer him. Outside, the street was still dark, the fog sitting low over the hedgerows along Byram Shore Road, swallowing the orange glow of the streetlights before they could reach the pavement. I strapped Finn into his car seat, settled him carefully, and closed the door without a sound. I sat behind the wheel for a moment before starting the engine. Behind me, through this kitchen window, I could see the warm light of the room I had just left. I could see Donovan's silhouette moving toward the counter. I heard faintly through the glass and the fog the distinct sound of a champagne cork. They were celebrating. I pulled out of the driveway and into the empty street. What Donovan and Sabrina did not know, what they could not have known, because they had never once thought to look, was that the house they were standing in, the house whose refrigerator Sabrina had opened as though it were already hers, had not belonged to either of them for 31 days. The fog on I-95 that morning was the kind that doesn't lift. It just sits low and dense, pressing down on the highway, until the headlights of every car ahead of you dissolve into nothing useful. I drove at half the speed I normally would have, one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the back of Finn's seat. He was still asleep. I could hear his breathing through the quiet of the car, slower now, more even the shallow labor of the fever hours behind us. His cheeks were still flushed when I had strapped him in, but the heat in them had softened. Children recover faster than adults. I had read that somewhere in the early weeks in one of the parenting books I had gone through alone on the couch while Donovan worked late. It had turned out to be true. I did not turn on the radio. There was nothing I needed to hear from the outside world at 5:30 in the morning on the first day of January. What I needed was the quiet and the road and the particular kind of thinking that only happens when everything else falls away. I had not cried. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect tears in a moment like that one, the moment you walk out of a house with a suitcase and a baby and a marriage signed away on a kitchen table. I had felt something, but it wasn't grief. It was closer to the sensation of setting down something very heavy that you have been carrying for so long, you stopped noticing the weight. Not relief exactly, just the absence of a pressure I had grown accustomed to. The highway stretched out ahead of me, empty in both directions, and I let my mind go back the way you do when you finally have the space for it. 3 years earlier, I had been someone different. Not a different person, the same values, the same way of moving through the world, but someone with more of herself intact. I had worked for 6 years as a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm in Stamford, the kind of work that requires you to look at numbers the way a doctor looks at symptoms, not just at what they say, but at what they are trying not to say. I was good at it. I understood how money moves, how accounts can be made to look like one thing while quietly being another, how a pattern of small discrepancies can tell a larger story if you are patient enough to read it. When I met Donovan, I was 31. He was charming in the particular way of men who have been told their whole lives that they are exceptional, confident without effort, easy in any room, the kind of person who makes you feel in the early days that being chosen by them means something. We married 14 months after our first date. I left my job when I became pregnant because the hours and the commute and the nausea made the combination impossible, and because Donovan said it made more sense, and because I believed at the time that the things I was setting aside would still be there when I was ready to come back to them. I had been wrong about that, but that is a different kind of lesson. The change in Donovan did not happen all at once. That is the thing about slow erosion, you don't notice the ground shifting until you look down and realize you are standing somewhere entirely different from where you started. He began working later. The conversations that had once stretched past midnight shortened to exchanges about logistics, about schedules, about the house. He stopped asking about the things I thought about. He stopped being curious about me, which is a particular kind of abandonment that leaves no visible mark. By the time Finn was born, the distance between us had grown wide enough to have its own weather. I took on everything without announcing that I was doing it, which was my own mistake as much as anyone's. The nights, the feedings, the doctor visits, the management of a household that ran on invisible labor. I absorbed it all into my routine the way you absorb any burden that comes gradually enough not to trigger alarm. And I told myself that this was temporary, that things would settle, that Donovan would find his way back to the version of himself I had married. But numbers don't lie, and I had always been better with numbers than with hope. The first discrepancy I noticed was 7 months after Finn was born. A transfer from our joint account to one I didn't recognize, not large enough to be alarming at first glance, but irregular in its timing and its amount. I noted it the way I used to note anomalies at work, quietly without reaction, with the intention of watching for a pattern. The pattern came. Over the following weeks, small amounts moved in ways that didn't align with anything Donovan had mentioned. Then larger ones. Then the account that shouldn't have existed at all. I did not confront him. I want to explain that decision because I know how it sounds. The reason I said nothing was not fear, and it was not passivity. It was the same instinct that had made me good at my job. The understanding that when something is wrong with the numbers, the worst thing you can do is announce that you have noticed. You watch, you document, you wait until you have the full picture because a partial picture only gives the other side time to adjust. So I watched, and I documented, and I made copies of everything I had legitimate access to, as his wife, bank statements, property records, insurance documents, and I kept them somewhere Donovan would never think to look, because Donovan had never once thought to look anywhere when it came to me. I had been building that file for 4 months by the time he walked through the kitchen door that morning. The fog began to thin slightly as I crossed into Stamford. The sky was still dark, but the darkness had taken on a different quality, the particular shade that comes just before the world remembers it is supposed to get light. I took the exit for Shippen Point and followed the road along the waterfront, where the houses sat quiet and close together, their porch lights burning in the early morning gray. I had not called ahead. I had not sent a message. There was one person who would understand why I had appeared at her door before sunrise on New Year's morning, and she was the only person I had driven toward. I turned onto her street and slowed. The light in Loretta Finch's front window was on. Not the kind of light that gets left on by accident, the warm, deliberate light of someone who is awake and has been for some time. She was standing at the door before I reached the end of her driveway, a wool robe pulled around her shoulders, her expression exactly what I needed it to be. Not surprised, not alarmed, just ready. She didn't say my name like a question. She said it the way you say the name of someone you have been expecting, the way you greet a person who has finally arrived after a journey you knew they would have to make. Come in, Celeste, I'll take the baby. Loretta Finch stepped back from the doorway and held out her arms, and I placed Finn into them without hesitation, which told me something about the state I was in, because I had not let anyone else hold him in weeks. She took him the way women of a certain experience take infants firmly, without fuss, settling him against her shoulder with a practiced ease that quieted him instantly. I had known Loretta for 11 years. She had lived 3 houses down from the apartment building where I spent my late 20s, a retired financial consultant who kept irregular hours, tended a garden that was better than anyone else's on the block, and had a habit of appearing at precisely the moments when her presence was most useful. We had become close in the gradual, unannounced way of people who don't make a production of friendship shared coffee on her porch on Sunday mornings, occasional dinners when neither of us felt like eating alone, conversations that ranged from serious to inconsequential without any particular effort to manage the difference. What I had not known until much later was the full depth of her connection to my family. But that would come. That morning she simply brought me inside. The house on Shippen Point was the kind of home that has been lived in long enough to become an extension of the person inside it. Bookshelves on every wall, a desk near the window stacked with folders and correspondence-framed photographs, placed without any particular system but with obvious intention. It smelled of wood smoke and the particular kind of tea she kept in a tin on the second shelf of her kitchen cabinet. I had been here enough times to know where the mugs were kept and which chair by the window was hers. She laid Finn in a portable bassinet she had set up near the radiator. It had not been there the last time I visited, which meant she had put it out recently, which meant something I didn't examine too closely yet. He settled without waking, his breathing deepening almost immediately into the slow rhythm of genuine sleep. I sat down at the kitchen table. Loretta filled the kettle and set it on the stove, then took the chair across from me and folded her hands on the table the way she always did when she intended to listen without interrupting. She was in her late 60s, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned over a long life that most situations resolve themselves better in silence than in noise. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said, "from the beginning." So I did. I told her about the 32 calls and the dead phone. I told her about Finn's fever climbing through the night, about the hours on the kitchen floor, about the footsteps I heard and the door I did not go to. I told her about Donovan's voice, flat without heat, the particular coldness of someone who has already moved on before the conversation has begun. I told her about Sabrina opening the refrigerator. I told her about the divorce papers and the pen and the way my hand had not shaken when I signed my name. Loretta listened to all of it without moving. When I finished, the kettle had begun to sound. She stood, filled 2 mugs, and set one in front of me before sitting back down. She looked at me for a long moment. "You don't seem surprised," I said. "I'm not," she replied. "I've been waiting for this conversation for about 2 years. I had hoped I was wrong." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Your father felt the same way. He said so the last time we spoke." I looked up at her. My father, Gerald Winchester, had died 18 months earlier. A quiet death, the kind that comes after a long illness has done its work and left everyone exhausted enough that the end arrives almost as a relief. He and Loretta had known each other for decades, a fact I had always understood in a general way without examining its specifics. I had assumed it was the ordinary overlap of 2 people who moved in similar professional circles in Fairfield County. I had, it turned out, significantly underestimated the nature of that overlap. "Your father was my most important client for 22 years, Loretta said. "Not my only client and not someone I discussed with others, which is why you may not have heard it described that way. I handled the structural management of Winchester Holdings from its early years through his retirement." She paused, watching my face. "He trusted very few people with that. I was one of them." Winchester Holdings. The name sat between us on the table like something that had been waiting for the right moment to be said aloud. I had grown up understanding that my family had resources without ever being given a precise accounting of what that meant. My father was not a man who discussed money with any enthusiasm. He believed with a quiet conviction that I had absorbed without realizing it, that the most valuable things a person owns are the things other people don't know to look for. He had raised me in a comfortable house in Greenwich, sent me to good schools, and given me a work ethic that came from expectation rather than instruction. What he had not given me until now was the full picture. Donovan never knew, I said. It was not a question. He knew your family was comfortable, Loretta said. He didn't know the scale. Your father made sure of that. He was very deliberate about what was visible and what wasn't. She tilted her head slightly. He also made some arrangements toward the end for exactly the situation you're now in. The kettle on the stove had gone quiet. Outside, the first gray light of morning was beginning to press against the kitchen window. Not sunrise yet, just the slow retreat of darkness that happens before the color comes. What kind of arrangements? I asked. Loretta stood and walked to the desk near the window. She opened the bottom drawer, the one that was always locked when I visited the one I had never thought to ask about, and withdrew a manila envelope. It was thick sealed and had been handled enough that the edges had softened slightly. My name was written on the front in my father's handwriting. Careful, deliberate, the particular lettering of a man who had always taken his time with anything that mattered. She set it on the table between us and sat back down. He told me to keep that until the night you came through my door with a suitcase and a child, she said. He said you would know what to do with it, he said. And here something moved briefly across her face. Not quite a smile, not quite grief, but somewhere between the two, that you had always been better at this than you gave yourself credit for. I sat with the envelope in front of me for a long moment, without touching it. Outside, a car passed slowly on the wet street. Finn made a small sound from the bassinet and then went quiet again. I reached out and picked it up. The envelope was heavier than it looked. I set it flat on the table and worked the seal open carefully, the way my father had always opened correspondence, without tearing, without rushing, with the particular patience of a man who believed that how you handled small things said something about how you would handle large ones. Inside were two separate items, a handwritten letter, 4 pages on his personal stationery, and a bound document roughly an inch thick, its cover page stamped with the seal of a Connecticut notary. I read the letter first. My father's handwriting had always been distinctive. Small, precise, the letters formed with the deliberateness of someone who had learned penmanship at a time when it was still considered a reflection of character. Seeing it on the page after 18 months was like hearing a familiar voice from another room, present and absent at the same time. He began the way he began most serious conversations, without preamble. Gerald Winchester had built Winchester Holdings over the course of 30 years, starting with a modest inheritance of his own and expanding it through a combination of careful investment, strategic patience, and an almost constitutional aversion to drawing attention to himself. The company managed private assets, real estate, long-term equity positions, a small number of carefully selected partnerships, and it did so quietly, which was precisely the point. My father had always believed that the loudest money was usually the most fragile. What he had built was designed to last, not to impress. He wrote that he had watched my relationship with Donovan Harmon with the particular concern of a parent who knows better than to say so directly. He had nothing against Donovan in any personal sense. What troubled him was simpler and more specific. Donovan had never once asked about my family in any depth. Not about my work, not about what I had studied, not about where we came from or what we had built. He had accepted the surface of things without curiosity, which my father had recognized as a warning sign long before I was willing to see it myself. He wrote, a man who does not ask questions about the woman he is marrying is a man who has already decided she fits inside the picture he has of himself. That kind of man does not adjust when the picture turns out to be wrong. He simply tries to remove what doesn't fit. I set the page down for a moment and looked out the kitchen window. The sky had shifted from black to a deep cold gray. Loretta was sitting across from me, not reading, not looking at her phone, simply present in the way that she had always been, a steadiness that asked nothing in return. I picked up the page and kept reading. My father explained this with the precision of someone who had thought through every implication. The house on Byram Shore Road had been purchased using funds from a trust established in my name by my paternal grandmother, Eleanor Winchester, who had died when I was 19. The transfer completed before any divorce filing was initiated moved the property out of the marital estate entirely and into a separate legal entity. Once recorded, the property belonged to Winchester Holdings, not to either spouse. No court could redistribute what was no longer in either party's name, provided they have not been commingled with marital funds. My father had ensured the purchase was made entirely through the trust with no contribution from Donovan or any joint account. Douglas Crane, the family's attorney for over 2 decades, had documented this clearly at the time of purchase and had maintained those records continuously. This was important for a reason my father had anticipated. If Donovan ever attempted to claim the property as a marital asset in divorce proceedings, the documentation would show unambiguously that it had never been his to claim. 31 days before the morning I was now living through, on the advice of Loretta and Douglas, I had signed papers transferring the Byram Shore Road property into Winchester Holdings. I had done this at Douglas's office on a Tuesday afternoon while Donovan was at a board lunch in the city. It had taken 40 minutes. Donovan had no legal standing to contest the transfer because the property had never been jointly owned. The house he had been living in, the house he had described to colleagues and friends as his, had been an asset of my family's company since the first week of December. I turned to the final page of the letter. My father had written toward the end about Douglas Crane, describing him as the most competent attorney he had ever worked with, a man who had handled the family's legal affairs with total discretion for more than 20 years. He had asked Douglas some months before his death to prepare a set of documents that would be held by Loretta and activated at my request. These included a formal power of attorney, allowing Douglas to act on my behalf in all financial and legal matters related to the marriage and its dissolution, a legal addendum drafted for the divorce proceedings, and a full accounting of Winchester Holdings' current assets and my position within the company as its sole heir. The bound document at the bottom of the envelope was that accounting. I did not read all of it that morning. I read enough. Winchester Holdings held interests in 11 properties across Connecticut and New York, a portfolio of long-term equity positions that had been compounding quietly for 3 decades, and 2 private partnership stakes that my father had never discussed with anyone outside of Loretta and Douglas. The total value as of the most recent quarterly review was a number that made the world feel suddenly vertiginously different from the one I had been living in. Donovan had married a woman he thought was comfortable. He had not done any of the reading. I folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it back in the envelope. The bound document I set to one side. Outside, the gray of the sky had lightened another degree. Finn was still asleep, one arm raised above his head in the total abandon of infant sleep. Loretta had not spoken since I began reading. When I finally looked up, she met my eyes with the calm expression of someone who has been waiting for a person to finish processing something large. "Douglas," I said. "He's expecting your call," she replied. "He has been for some time." She reached across the table and placed a business card next to my hand. Heavy stock, simple printing, a Park Avenue address. "He said whenever you're ready. There's no urgency from his end. He's done this kind of work before." I picked up the card and held it. Done this kind of work before. The quiet confidence of that phrase steadied me more than any reassurance would have. I did not need to be told that everything would be fine. I needed to know that the person across the table from me had seen this terrain before and understood how it worked. "I'll call him this morning," I said. Loretta nodded once. Then she stood, went to the stove, and refilled the kettle without being asked. I sat for another moment with the card in my hand and my father's envelope on the table in front of me, and I thought about the word he had used in the letter's final line. He had not written "good luck." He had not written, "I'm sorry it came to this." He had written in his careful small hand, "You were always the one who knew how to read the room. Trust that now." I set the card down beside the envelope, straightened both, and reached for my tea. I left Finn with Loretta the next morning and took the 7:45 train from Stamford into the city. It was the second day of January, and Grand Central was quieter than usual, the particular quiet of a holiday week, when the city hasn't fully remembered itself yet, when the platforms echo a little more than they should, and the commuters move with less urgency than the architecture demands. I took the subway uptown and walked the last 3 blocks to Park Avenue in the cold, my coat collar up the business card in my jacket pocket. Douglas Crane's office was on the 34th floor of a building that had been standing long enough to have developed a certain indifference to the financial dramas that passed through it daily. There was no marble lobby, no art installed to intimidate. The elevator opened onto a reception area lined with bookshelves, staffed by a woman who gave me her name as Patricia and told me Mr. Crane was ready when I was. He was standing when I walked in. Douglas Crane was in his late 60s, solidly built with the kind of face that had settled into its final version some years ago and showed no particular interest in changing. He extended his hand across the desk with the directness of someone who does not use pleasantries as a delay tactic, and his handshake was the kind that tells you immediately whether a person means what they say. "Mrs. Harmon," he said, "sit down. Tell me where things stand from your perspective, and then I'll tell you where they stand from mine." I sat, and I told him. I had been carrying the summary in my head for months, the way you carry something you have rehearsed without knowing you were rehearsing it. I described the financial irregularities I had first noticed 7 months after Finn was born, the transfers from the joint account, the account that had no business existing, the pattern that had taken shape over the following weeks into something I could no longer explain away. I described what I had done about it, the copies I had made of every document I had legitimate access to as his wife, the systematic way I had organized them, the care I had taken to preserve originals while keeping working copies somewhere Donovan would never look. When I finished, I set the folder on his desk. Douglas opened it without hurry. He read the way experienced professionals read documents they have been anticipating, not quickly, not performing thoroughness, but with the genuine attention of someone who understands that details at this stage are not decoration. The office was quiet, except for the occasional sound of a page turning and far below the muffled rhythm of Park Avenue traffic. He spent 12 minutes with the folder before he looked up. "This is not the file of a woman who was caught off guard," he said. "No, I agreed. It isn't." He turned back to the documents and walked me through what he was seeing. Donovan, over a period of approximately 6 months, had been transferring corporate assets into an account registered in Sabrina Voss's name. The transfers were structured to stay below the threshold that would trigger automatic review, a practice sometimes called structuring, which is itself a federal offense when done to conceal financial activity. More relevantly for our purposes, the transfers represented a clear breach of what is known in corporate law as fiduciary duty, the legal obligation that company officers have to act in the best interests of the company rather than their own. As a principal of his firm, Donovan had an enforceable duty not to redirect company funds for personal use or benefit. Each transfer he had made was a documented violation of that duty. I had known the transfers were suspicious. I had not known precisely what category of wrong they fell into. Having a name for it changed something, made it less of a feeling and more of a fact. Douglas then turned to a separate section of the folder, the divorce paperwork itself. He explained what he had prepared on my behalf and what it contained. The standard divorce filing in Connecticut initiates a process called financial discovery, in which both parties are required to make full disclosure of their assets, income, and liabilities. Given the documentation I had provided, Douglas anticipated that Donovan's discovery responses would be incomplete, and that the discrepancy between what he disclosed and what the record showed would become the central issue in the proceedings. There was also the matter of the addendum. Douglas explained this carefully because it was the piece I wanted to understand precisely. Several months before the events of New Year's morning, he had prepared a legal addendum to the divorce agreement, a supplementary document that established the terms of financial restitution in the event that marital misconduct could be proven to the court's satisfaction. The addendum was not hidden or inserted deceptively. It was part of the formal divorce packet that Donovan had been presented with and had signed in full. Under Connecticut law, Both parties to a divorce agreement are presumed to have read and understood the documents they sign, particularly when those documents are prepared by a licensed attorney and notarized. The notary's stamp on the addendum was dated witnessed and entirely valid. Donovan had signed 47 pages at 5:15 in the morning without reading one of them. The addendum specified that if the court determined that marital assets had been concealed, transferred, or otherwise manipulated in bad faith during the marriage, the offending party would be liable for full financial restitution to the other party, calculated against the documented value of the assets in question. Given what the transfers to Sabrina's account represented, and given the documentation I had assembled, Douglas assessed our position as, in his precise phrasing, considerably stronger than the other side was likely to expect. "He doesn't just have a weak case," Douglas said, setting the folder down and looking at me directly. "He has no case. Every move he made against himself. The documentation you've assembled turns each one of those moves into evidence." I let that settle for a moment. I had spent 4 months building that file in the hours after Finn went to sleep at the kitchen table, in a house that I had not known at the time was already in the process of becoming mine in a different way. I had done it without knowing exactly what it would be used for, or when, only that the alternative, ignoring what I could clearly see, was not something I was willing to do. "What do we do first?" I asked. Douglas picked up a pen. "We file for temporary custody. That goes in today. Then we initiate financial discovery, which puts Donovan under a legal obligation to disclose everything and gives us the mechanism to demonstrate when he doesn't." He made a note on the legal pad in front of him. "We move carefully, and we move in sequence. The documentation does the work. We don't need drama." He set down the pen and looked at me again. "There is one more thing," he said, "about the property on Byram Shore Road." He leaned back slightly. "I want to make sure you understand exactly what happened 31 days before yesterday morning, and what it means for where things go from here." Douglas walked me through it, the way you'd explain a chess game to someone who had been playing, without knowing all the rules, move by move, with the consequence of each move made clear before the next one was introduced. The property at Byram Shore Road had been purchased in my name alone in the spring of the year Donovan and I got engaged. The funds came entirely from a trust my grandmother had established for me decades earlier, what lawyers call separate property, untouched by the marriage, and never combined with any joint account. The property had been transferred to Winchester Holdings before the divorce filing was initiated. Under Connecticut law, assets belonging to a third-party entity are outside the marital estate and cannot be subject to equitable distribution between the spouses regardless of how they were originally acquired. It remains separate as long as it has not been deliberately combined with joint funds, a process lawyers call commingling. Douglas had been careful from the beginning to ensure that not a single dollar of Donovan's income or our joint accounts had ever touched the Byram Shore Road property. Every tax filing, every insurance payment, every maintenance invoice had been routed through the trust. The paper trail was unambiguous. Because the property was mine alone, I had the legal right to transfer it to any entity I chose without Donovan's knowledge or consent. On the 3rd of December, on a Tuesday afternoon while Donovan was at a board lunch in Manhattan, I had done exactly that. Douglas had prepared the transfer documents, a Connecticut notary had witnessed my signature, and the deed had been recorded with the town clerk's office in Greenwich 4 business days later. Winchester Holdings was now the property's legal owner of record. What this meant in practical terms was straightforward. Donovan had no ownership interest in the Byram Shore Road property, and never had. Any claim he might attempt to make to it in divorce proceedings would be unsupported by the chain of title, the documented history of who has owned a property, and when, which was clean complete and entirely inconsistent with his understanding of the situation. Douglas set down his pen. "He's going to find out today or tomorrow when his attorney runs the title search, standard procedure in any divorce involving real property." He paused. "I'd like you to be prepared for that to change the tone of things considerably." I told him I was prepared. That evening back at Loretta's house in Stamford, I received the first call from a man named Garrett Sloane. Garrett had been recommended to me by Douglas 3 weeks earlier during one of the preparatory conversations we had held in the months before New Year's morning. He worked as a licensed private investigator out of a small office in Stamford, with a background in corporate security and a professional reputation that Douglas described simply as thorough. I had spoken with him twice by phone before that evening. He was not a man who used more words than necessary, which I had come to appreciate. He called at 7:43. Loretta was reading in the other room. Finn had finished his evening feeding and was asleep in the bassinet, his arms spread wide in the unguarded way of children who have not yet learned to protect themselves in sleep. "I have an update on the property situation," Garrett said. "Donovan's attorney ran the title search this afternoon. They found the transfer." I asked how Donovan had reacted. Garrett had a contact at the firm Donovan used, not inside information, just the ordinary professional overlap that exists in a county where everyone in a certain field eventually knows everyone else. What he had been able to piece together was this: Donovan's attorney had called him at approximately 4 in the afternoon. The call had lasted 11 minutes. Donovan had then been heard through what Garrett described as a thin office wall, speaking at a volume inconsistent with a routine business conversation. "He didn't take it quietly," Garrett said. "I thought about that for a moment, about Donovan in his Greenwich office in the suite he had still been wearing when he walked through the kitchen door holding a phone and discovering that the house he had been living in and describing as his own had belonged to someone else for the better part of a month. I thought about the champagne he had opened that morning, and the particular confidence of a man who had spent 3 years not asking questions about the woman he had married." "What did he do after?" I asked. Garrett said Donovan had left the office at 4:30 and driven home. He had spent approximately 2 hours in the house before leaving again. During that time, he had made 3 phone calls, 2 to attorneys whose numbers Garrett had not yet identified, and 1 to a number registered to Randolph Harmon, his father. "Randolph Harmon." I filed that detail away without comment. "There's something else," Garrett said. "He had a way of delivering additional information that made you pay closer attention rather than less, a quality I suspected was intentional. I've been watching the activity on the corporate accounts. There was a transfer this afternoon about an hour after the title search came back. Smaller than the previous ones. Looks like he's accelerating." The previous transfers had been deliberate and patient-structured to avoid triggering review spread across weeks. An accelerated transfer suggested a change in his thinking. It suggested that he now understood, at least partially, that the situation was not what he had believed it to be when he poured that champagne. A man who is confident does not accelerate. A man who is beginning to understand that he has made a serious miscalculation does. "Document everything," I said. "Already done," Garrett replied. "I'll send the formal report tonight." A brief pause. "One more thing. I've been thinking about the inside of the house. If you want continuous documentation of what's happening in there, I have a suggestion. It would require placing someone on the inside, someone Donovan would have no reason to look at twice." Another pause shorter. "Douglas mentioned you might be open to the idea." I looked across the hallway to where Loretta was sitting with her book, her reading lamp casting a warm circle of light on the page. "Tell me what you have in mind," I said. Garrett Sloane's office was on the second floor of a converted brick building on Atlantic Street in Stamford, the kind of space that had been a storage room in a previous life and had been made functional rather than comfortable. A desk, 2 chairs, a filing cabinet with a combination lock, a window that looked out onto a parking structure. The only decoration was a framed copy of his Connecticut private investigator license on the wall behind him, which told me everything I needed to know about his priorities. He was already seated when I arrived the following morning, a legal pad open in front of him, and a coffee going cold beside it. He was younger than I had expected from his voice, early 40s, with the kind of build and stillness that comes from years of being in rooms where drawing attention to yourself is a professional liability. He stood when I entered, gestured to the chair across from him, and waited until I was settled before he spoke. "The house," he said without introduction. "The question is documentation. What happens inside that property over the next several weeks will either strengthen your position considerably or give the other side room to maneuver. Right now, they don't know how much you know. I'd like to keep it that way while we fill in whatever gaps remain." His proposal was straightforward. The household at Byram Shore Road had recently lost its housekeeper, a woman who had worked there for 4 years, and had given notice the previous month for reasons unrelated to any of this. The position had not yet been filled. Garrett had a candidate, Agnes Pruitt, a woman in her late 50s, who had spent the previous decade doing residential work for high-net-worth families in Fairfield County, and whose professional history he had already verified thoroughly. Agnes was not. He was careful to explain, an employee of his firm. She was an independent contractor who had worked with him on 2 previous engagements, always in a support capacity, always within the boundaries of what Connecticut law permitted. Her role would be to observe and to report, nothing more. She would not be asked to access private communications, to take anything that did not belong to her, or to do anything that a household employee would not ordinarily do in the course of their work. What she would do, what she was by his account exceptionally good at, was notice things. I asked how she would get the position without raising questions. Garrett explained that Donovan had posted the housekeeper role through a domestic staffing agency the previous week. Agnes had already submitted an application through the standard process. Her references were legitimate, her background check would clear, and there was nothing in her professional presentation that would give anyone pause. She would be hired if everything proceeded normally within the next 48 hours. "I want to meet her first," I said. He had anticipated this. Agnes Pruitt arrived 20 minutes later, having apparently been waiting in the coffee shop on the ground floor. Garrett had prepared her application months earlier. She was the contingency he had arranged before I ever needed to ask for one. She was a compact woman with gray streaked hair, worn, pulled-back, steady eyes, and the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent years working in other people's homes without disturbing the atmosphere. She sat down, folded her hands, and looked at me without any of the performative deference I might have expected. I asked her a single question: what she understood her role to be. She said, "To do my job well enough that no one thinks about me and to remember everything I see." That was sufficient. Agnes began at the Byram Shore Road property on the 5th of January. Each evening she sent a brief written summary to Garrett, who synthesized the reports and forwarded a consolidated version to me. I read them at Loretta's kitchen table after Finn went down for the night, with a cup of tea going warm beside me, and the particular focused quiet of someone reviewing evidence rather than reading for pleasure. The first 3 days were largely logistical. Agnes establishing her routine, mapping the rhythms of the household, identifying which rooms were used when and by whom. What emerged from those early reports was a picture of a household that had reorganized itself around Sabrina Voss with a speed that suggested the reorganization had been anticipated. She had moved into the master bedroom. Her belongings occupied the closet space that had previously been mine. She used the kitchen as though she had always lived there, which, given what I now understood about the timeline, she may have been preparing to do for quite some time. On the 6th of January, Agnes reported that Donovan and Sabrina had spent 2 hours in the home office with documents spread across the desk, property records by the look of them, and what appeared to be corporate financial statements. Donovan had made 4 phone calls during that session, 2 of which Agnes had been close enough to the door to partially hear. The substance of what she caught was consistent with what Garrett had already documented. Donovan was trying to understand how much had moved beyond his control and how quickly. On the 7th evening, the report was longer than the previous ones. Garrett called rather than sending the written summary, which told me before he spoke that the content warranted a conversation. "2 things," he said. "First, we have clear documentation of controlled substance use in the property. Both of them on at least 3 occasions this week." Agnes confirmed it directly. He paused to let that register. In Connecticut, evidence of illegal activity in the home is relevant to custody determinations, particularly when a child will be spending time in that environment. Douglas would want to know. Second, and this is the part I wanted to tell you directly, Sabrina accessed the master bedroom safe twice today. She didn't open it either time. She was testing combinations. I set down my tea. Winchester Holdings, as the legal owner of the property, had the right to install security equipment throughout the house, including cameras in common areas and hallways. Garrett had arranged for this to be done quietly during Agnes's first day when Donovan was at his office and Sabrina was out. The footage was time-stamped and stored on a secure server that Douglas's office controlled. Every attempt Sabrina made at that safe was recorded. The safe itself currently contained the original documents from my father's estate items I had not removed before leaving, items whose absence Donovan had not yet mentioned, which told me he either didn't know they were there or hadn't thought to look. I had one call to make before I went to sleep that night. Douglas answered on the second ring. "The jewelry," I said. "It's time to put it in the safe." He understood immediately. We had discussed this contingency weeks earlier, a specific collection of pieces that had belonged to my grandmother, appraised at a significant value, documented extensively, and titled formally as Assets of Winchester Holdings. Placing them in the safe would serve a precise legal purpose. It would establish with full documentation that Sabrina had no authorized access to the contents of that safe, because Winchester Holdings had formally recorded the presence of its assets within it. Douglas would have a notice of restricted access delivered to the property the following morning, a formal written communication from Winchester Holdings to all occupants of the Byram Shore Road address, specifying that the safe and its contents were the exclusive property of Winchester Holdings, and that any unauthorized access or removal would constitute theft under Connecticut law. The notice would be delivered before Sabrina tried a third time. "I'll have it there by 9, Douglas said. I thanked him and ended the call. Through the wall, I could hear Finn making the small sounds he made when he was cycling through the light stages of sleep without waking, a murmur, a shift, then silence again. I sat for a moment in the kitchen quiet before getting up to check on him. We are exactly halfway through this story, and what happens next is where everything shifts. Before I go any further, drop a "still here" in the comments so I know you are with me. Every single comment means more than you think. One thing before we continue, parts of what follows are fictional, built for storytelling and reflection. If that is not something you want to hear, this is a kind moment to step away. No hard feelings at all. By the end of the first week at Loretta's, Finn's fever had broken completely. It happened the way recoveries happen with very young children, not gradually, but all at once, as though his body had simply decided it was finished with being sick and moved on without consulting anyone. One morning, he woke up with clear eyes and a hunger that was twice what it had been the previous day. And by afternoon, he was reaching for things again, his small hands opening and closing with the purposeful curiosity that I had been watching for since the night his temperature climbed past 102 on a kitchen floor in Greenwich. I sat with him in the armchair by Loretta's front window that afternoon, his weight solid and warm against my chest, and I let myself feel for a few minutes something that was not strategy. Then I got back to work. The idea for Meridian Capital Fund had come to me 6 weeks before New Year's morning, during one of the late-night hours when Finn was asleep and the house was quiet enough to think clearly. It had begun as an observation rather than a plan. Donovan, in his growing anxiety about the financial situation he had created for himself, would be looking for ways to recover ground quickly. He was not at his core a patient investor. He understood appearances and momentum, and he had always been drawn to opportunities that promised significant returns in compressed timeframes, the kind of investment that rewards confidence and punishes careful reading. What he needed, in other words, was exactly the kind of fund that Meridian Capital was designed to be. I want to be precise about what Meridian was because the distinction matters. It was not a fabrication. It was a legitimate investment vehicle, a private fund registered as a limited liability company in Delaware, which is the standard jurisdiction for such entities because of its well-established corporate law framework and its administrative efficiency. Delaware LLC registrations are a routine instrument in the financial industry used by thousands of legitimate funds. Meridian had a real registration number, a real employer identification number issued by the IRS, and a real bank account. What it did not have was outside investors or any obligation to the public markets. It existed solely to receive what Donovan chose to send it, and to document that choice precisely and permanently. The fund's documentation had been prepared by Douglas over the preceding weeks within the boundaries of what was legally permissible. Its investment thesis was written to appeal to precisely the kind of investor Donovan was. High projected returns, a compressed investment horizon, and just enough technical language to reward someone who read quickly and didn't ask follow-up questions. Loretta handled the introduction. She had spent 30 years in financial consulting in Fairfield County, which meant she had 30 years of professional relationships, advisors, fund managers, analysts, the kind of people whose opinions carried weight in the circles Donovan moved through. She identified a contact, a retired portfolio manager who owed her a professional favor and who could, without lying, describe Meridian as a vehicle worth a closer look. The contact passed the information to a mutual acquaintance. The mutual acquaintance mentioned it to Donovan at a lunch meeting that had nothing to do with any of this. Donovan called the Meridian contact number within 48 hours. I was sitting at Loretta's kitchen table when Douglas forwarded me the notification. The call had lasted 19 minutes. Donovan had asked the right questions on the surface projected returns investment timeline, minimum commitment, but had not asked the questions that would have required real answers. He had not requested an independent audit. He had not asked for the fund's regulatory filings. He had not, in short, done any of the reading that a person in his position should have done before committing a single dollar. What he did instead was call Sabrina. Agnes reported that conversation the following evening. Sabrina's response, according to what Agnes was able to piece together from her end of the exchange, was immediate and enthusiastic. She saw in Meridian what Donovan saw, a way to recoup what they had lost quickly before the legal proceedings gained further momentum. She encouraged him to move aggressively. On the 14th of January, at 11:43 in the evening, Donovan transferred $4,200,000 from a corporate operating account into Meridian's registered bank account. The transfer was made without the authorization of his company's board of directors, a body whose approval is required under the firm's own operating agreement for any single outlay exceeding $500,000. This was not a technicality. It was a clear and documented violation of the fiduciary duty he owed to his company and its stakeholders. It was also because the transfer involved moving corporate funds into an account he had not disclosed to the board or to me during the divorce proceedings, potentially actionable as corporate fraud, a matter that fell within the investigative jurisdiction of the Securities and Exchange Commission. Douglas had already been in contact with the SEC's regional office in New York for 2 weeks by the time the transfer came through. The documentation we had assembled the structured transfers to Sabrina's account, the offshore account activity Garrett had identified, and now the Meridian transfer formed a pattern that the agency's investigators would find straightforward to follow. The $4.2 million landed in Meridian's account and stayed there frozen under a legal hold that Douglas had arranged in advance pending the outcome of the proceedings. I closed the laptop and set it on the table. Loretta was in the armchair across the room, not reading, just sitting in the way she sometimes did in the evenings when the day had been long enough to warrant stillness. She looked up when I closed the laptop. "Meridian is done," I said. She nodded once, the way she nodded when something had gone according to a plan that had required a great deal of patience to execute. I poured the last of the tea into my cup and stood at the kitchen window for a moment. The street outside was dark, the houses across the way showing the quiet light of people settled in for the night. Stamford, in January, in the middle of the week, in the particular stillness of a neighborhood that goes to sleep early. I thought about Donovan sitting at a desk somewhere, or perhaps already in bed, believing that the Meridian transfer had bought him time and leverage, believing that the situation which had looked so unfavorable since the title search had shifted back in his direction. I thought about how much he still didn't know. "There's one more piece," I said, still looking out the window. "Meridian was about Donovan. The next part is about Sabrina." I turned back to the room. "She's been helping him hide things. She's also been looking for a way out of her own, something better, something that doesn't depend on him." I set down the cup. "I think it's time to give her the opportunity she's been looking for." 2 days after the Meridian transfer cleared, I opened a laptop that Loretta had purchased with cash from an electronics store in Bridgeport and created a name. Victor Aldridge, Private Equity, San Francisco. I want to explain what this was and what it was not, because the distinction matters in a way that I had thought through carefully with Douglas before I began. What I was doing was not entrapment, a legal concept that applies to law enforcement, inducing someone to commit a crime they would not otherwise have committed. Victor Aldridge was not going to ask Sabrina Voss to do anything. He was simply going to exist attractively in a space where she was already looking. Whatever she chose to do with that existence would be entirely her own decision. Douglas had been explicit on this point. The communications Sabrina sent to Victor Aldridge would be voluntary disclosures information she chose to share of her own free will to a contact she had chosen to engage with for reasons entirely her own. The fact that Victor was not a real person did not make those disclosures any less voluntary or any less admissible as evidence in civil proceedings. What it did was give her an audience she believed was safe, which meant she was less likely to be careful about what she said. The profile I constructed was specific without being verifiable to anyone who didn't have resources and time. A Stanford MBA, decade in San Francisco venture capital, a current focus on East Coast real estate and private credit markets. The kind of background that would be credible to someone like Sabrina, sophisticated enough to impress, adjacent enough to her world to feel familiar. The Instagram account had been active for 8 months, populated with the kind of content that suggested a life rather than performing one. Garrett had assisted with the technical elements, ensuring that the account's metadata and activity patterns would withstand a casual check. I sent the first message on the 16th of January. It was brief, a reference to a conference she had attended the previous fall, which Agnes had mentioned in one of her early reports as something Sabrina had brought up in conversation at the house. A question about her work, nothing that required a response. The kind of message that a confident person sends when they are interested but not desperate, which in my experience of how Donovan operated was exactly the register Sabrina would respond to. She replied within 3 hours. Over the following 9 days, I learned things about Sabrina Voss that Garrett's reports had suggested, but not confirmed. She was at her core a person who had always believed she was meant for something larger than what she currently had. Donovan had represented an upgrade from her previous situation, but she had understood from early on that he was not the final destination. She was in the language she used with Victor Aldridge between positions, using the current arrangement as a bridge to something better, something more stable, something that didn't require her to manage a man's anxiety about his legal situation while simultaneously pretending she hadn't helped create it. She was, in other words, exactly as Garrett's profile of her had suggested. Practical, opportunistic, and entirely willing to reframe her loyalties when a better option presented itself. The information came gradually at first, then with increasing speed as her investment in the exchange grew. She described Donovan's business structure in terms that were more specific than anything he had disclosed in the divorce proceedings. She referenced the offshore accounts by the bank names institutions in the Cayman Islands and one in Luxembourg that Garrett had identified by pattern but not yet confirmed by name. She described the mechanism by which certain corporate revenues had been underreported to reduce tax liability in enough detail that Douglas said when I forwarded the transcript that it was the clearest voluntary account of the activity he had seen. She also told me something I had not expected. On the 21st of January, in the middle of an exchange that had been moving quickly, Sabrina wrote that she had known about the plan to end the marriage for longer than anyone realized. Not weeks, months. She and Donovan had discussed it the previous summer when I was 7 months pregnant. The decision to wait until after Finn was born had been deliberate. They had believed, she wrote without apparent discomfort, that having a newborn would make me less likely to act decisively. I read that message twice, then I read it a third time. I had suspected the timeline was longer than a single impulsive evening. I had not known precisely how long or that the calculation had been that specific. Knowing it now did not change anything about the plan or its execution. But it settled something in me that I had not realized was still unsettled, the last remaining question, about whether I had missed something I should have seen sooner. I had not. There had been nothing to see. They had been careful precisely because they understood what was at stake if I had time to prepare. They had simply underestimated how much I had prepared anyway. On the 24th of January, Sabrina sent Victor Aldridge a compressed file containing what she described as an overview of the business opportunities. She had access to a document that turned out to include internal financial records from Donovan's firm, records she had access to as his executive assistant. Her credentials never having been restricted, despite the divorce filing a summary of the offshore account structure and a list of the corporate partners who had participated in the underreporting arrangement. I forwarded everything to Douglas within the hour. His response came back in under 10 minutes, a single line that read, "This is sufficient for referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office in addition to the SEC matter." I closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet of Loretta's kitchen. Outside, the last week of January had brought a fresh round of cold, the deep-settled cold of a New England winter that has stopped apologizing for itself. Through the window, I could see the bare branches of the oak at the edge of the property, perfectly still in the frozen air. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, a message from Garrett sent without preamble in the way he always sent messages that required immediate attention. It read, "Subject Voss entered master bedroom alone at 9:14. Safe is open." 3 days after Sabrina opened the safe, Garrett sent me a video file. No message accompanied it. Just the file compressed and labeled with a date stamp arriving in the secure inbox that Douglas's office had set up for exactly this kind of material. I opened it at the kitchen table at Loretta's house, while the morning was still gray outside, and Finn was finishing his breakfast in the high chair Loretta had borrowed from a neighbor. The footage was clear. Agnes had worked with Garrett to position the cameras in the upstairs hallway and the entrance to the master bedroom in a way that captured the doorway without entering the room itself, a deliberate choice that Douglas had specified to ensure the recordings remained within the boundaries of what Winchester Holdings, as the legal owner of the property, was permitted to document in common areas and access points of its own asset. The timestamp in the lower right corner read, January 25th, 9:14 in the evening. Sabrina entered the master bedroom alone. She moved with the confidence of someone who had been thinking about this for longer than the previous evening. She went directly to the closet where the safe was recessed into the wall, crouched in front of it, and worked through the combination with the particular focus of a person who has been practicing. It opened on the third attempt. The combination had not been changed since the notice of restricted access was delivered, which was an intentional decision. Changing it would have told her the safe had been flagged. Leaving it unchanged told her nothing, which was more useful. She lifted the lid and looked at what was inside. The collection my grandmother had assembled over 40 years was not ostentatious in the way that some jewelry is. It did not announce itself. It was simply very good, the kind of quality that a person with knowledge recognizes immediately, and a person without knowledge may underestimate. A diamond and sapphire necklace, 3 rings, 2 bracelets, and a pair of earrings, all in original cases, all accompanied by appraisal certificates that Douglas had placed in the safe alongside them. The most recent appraisal, conducted 6 months earlier, placed the collection's total value at just under $2 million. Sabrina took the entire collection. She transferred each piece from its case to a cloth bag she had brought with her, unhurried, methodical, and left the empty cases arranged back in the safe before closing it. Then she left the room. The footage caught her crossing the hallway toward the guest room she had been using as a dressing area, the bag in her hand without any apparent awareness that she had just removed property belonging to Winchester Holdings from a safe she had been formally notified in writing she had no authorization to access. The notice of restricted access that Douglas had delivered on the morning of January 8th had been received and signed for by Donovan Harmon at the front door of the property. Under Connecticut law, notice delivered to one occupant of a residence is considered notice to all occupants when the communication concerns the property itself. Donovan's signature on the delivery confirmation meant that Sabrina's claim to ignorance of the restrictions had a very specific legal ceiling. I called Douglas before the footage had finished playing. He had already heard from Garrett. By the time we spoke, he had prepared a theft report to be filed with the Greenwich Police Department, accompanied by a copy of the notice of restricted access, the delivery confirmation with Donovan's signature, and the appraisal certificates establishing the collection's value. The police report would categorize the removal as first-degree larceny under Connecticut statute, the applicable charge when the value of stolen property exceeds $20,000. At just under $2 million, the collection placed the offense significantly above that threshold. I asked about the store. Douglas explained that Garrett had been following Sabrina since the previous evening at my standing request for monitoring of any unusual activity. She had driven to a high-end resale and consignment dealer on Greenwich Avenue that morning, a well-regarded establishment that handled estate jewelry and luxury goods. The store's staff had conducted a preliminary assessment and confirmed the collection appeared to be of significant value before initiating the paperwork for consignment. Greenwich police arrived at the store at 11:47 in the morning. Garrett called me when it was done. His voice carried the same flat efficiency it always did, but there was a precision to how he delivered the information that told me he understood its weight. "She didn't run," he said. "When the officers came in, she was still at the counter reviewing the consignment agreement. She just stood there." I thought about that image for a moment. Sabrina at a counter on Greenwich Avenue, a consignment form in front of her, the collection spread out under the store's lighting, and two officers walking in. I thought about the particular stillness that descends on a person when something they have set in motion arrives at its conclusion in a way they had not prepared for. "Is she in custody?" I asked. "Processed and released on bond," Garrett said. "Her attorney showed up within the hour." A pause. Donovan's attorney was with him when he got the call. According to my contact at the firm, Donovan's response was not quiet. I thanked Garrett and ended the call. I sat for a moment with the phone on the table. Finn had finished his breakfast and was examining the edge of his tray with the focused attention he brought to everything new, turning it in his hands as though it contained information worth extracting. I watched him for a moment before I picked up the phone again. Douglas called before I could dial his number. "Donovan's attorney contacted me 20 minutes ago," he said. "Not about Sabrina's arrest, about the divorce paperwork." His tone was measured in the particular way it became when he was conveying something significant without editorializing. "They found the addendum. They want to discuss it." I looked out the window at the pale January light settling on Loretta's front garden. "Tell them we're available Thursday," I said. Douglas called me Wednesday evening to confirm the meeting was set for 10 o'clock the following morning at his Park Avenue office. He also told me in the same call that Donovan's attorney had requested a pre-meeting conversation, just the two lawyers without clients present, to discuss the parameters of what would be addressed. Douglas had declined. In his experience, he said pre-meeting conversations of that kind were less about establishing parameters and more about taking the temperature of the other side before committing to a position. He preferred to let the documents speak first. I took the 7:45 train into the city again, the same service I had taken the morning after New Year's. The car was fuller this time. The holiday quiet had lifted, and the commuters had returned their faces, carrying the particular settled resignation of people who have accepted that January is simply what it is. I sat by the window and watched the Connecticut shoreline give way to the outskirts of the city, and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of preparation. Donovan's attorney was already in the conference room when I arrived. His name was Peter Calloway, a partner at a mid-sized firm in Greenwich that handled corporate and family law for clients in the upper tier of Fairfield County. He was in his mid-50s, well-dressed in the way of men who have been dressing for rooms like this one for long enough that it requires no thought, and he had the careful expression of someone who had reviewed the addendum thoroughly and understood exactly what it meant for his client's position. He stood when I entered. We exchanged the minimal pleasantries that the situation permitted and sat down. Douglas opened the meeting by placing a copy of the addendum in the center of the table, the original with its notary stamp and witness signatures clearly visible on the final page. He said nothing. He simply set it down and waited, which was a technique I had seen him use before, and which I had come to understand as one of his more effective ones. It put the burden of the first substantive statement on the other side. Calloway picked up the document and set it back down without looking at it. He had clearly already read it enough times to have its structure memorized. "Our position," he said, is that this addendum was not adequately disclosed to my client at the time of signing. A document of this significance embedded within a larger filing at 5 in the morning, under circumstances that could be characterized as emotionally coercive, raises legitimate questions about informed consent. Douglas let a moment pass before responding. The addendum is a notarized legal document prepared by a licensed Connecticut attorney, he said. It was included in a filing that your client signed in full on 47 pages, with his signature appearing on each page where indicated. Connecticut law operates on the presumption that a competent adult who signs a legal document has read and understood its contents. That presumption exists precisely to prevent parties from later claiming ignorance of terms they chose not to read. He paused. The time of day at which your client chose to present and sign the divorce filing is not a factor that affects the document's validity. He was not under duress. He chose to proceed. Calloway shifted in his chair. The language regarding asset restitution is unusually broad. It is precisely as broad as the circumstances warranted, Douglas replied. The documented transfer of corporate funds to an unauthorized account, the structured movement of assets to avoid disclosure, and the offshore account activity that your client did not disclose in his initial financial statement all fall within the definition of bad faith asset manipulation, as specified in the addendum's language. The broadness as you characterize it is a reflection of the scope of the conduct. There was a silence in the room of the kind that happens when one side of a conversation has run out of angles and knows it. Calloway asked whether there was any flexibility on the restitution calculation. Douglas said there was not. What happened next was not dramatic in the way that legal confrontations are sometimes depicted. Calloway made two further attempts to find a viable objection, one questioning the timeline of the addendum's preparation, one suggesting that the financial documentation I had assembled might have been obtained improperly. Douglas addressed both with the same methodical precision, producing the relevant records in each case before Calloway had finished his sentence. By 11:40, the meeting was effectively over, though it would take another 20 minutes of procedural discussion before anyone acknowledged this. I had said almost nothing during the meeting. Douglas had not needed me to. I had sat with my hands folded on the table and listened to the case I had spent months building be laid out piece by piece, and I had watched Peter Calloway's expression move through the stages. That expressions move through when a person is receiving information that confirms what they had already privately suspected. On the train back to Stamford, my phone showed a message from Douglas, sent during the meeting's closing minutes to my phone rather than spoken aloud. It read, "SEC has formally frozen the Meridian account. Donovan's corporate board has been notified of the unauthorized transfer and has retained independent counsel. This changes his exposure significantly." I read the message twice and put the phone in my pocket. The SEC freeze meant that the $4.2 million Donovan had transferred on the 14th of January was now under federal hold, inaccessible to him, and subject to ongoing investigation. The corporate board's decision to retain independent counsel meant that his own company was now treating him as a subject of internal inquiry rather than a principal to be protected. These two developments, arriving on the same morning as the addendum meeting, represented a compression of pressure from three directions, simultaneously legal, financial, and professional, that left very little room to maneuver. A man with options moves slowly. A man without them moves fast and usually in the wrong direction. I looked out the train window as we crossed back into Connecticut, the gray water of the Sound visible between the buildings along the shore. Finn would be awake from his morning nap by the time I got back to Loretta's. I had been away for less than 4 hours. I thought about the Harmon family home in Bellhaven, the large property on the Sound side of Greenwich, where Nadine and Randolph hosted their regular gatherings for the social tier they had cultivated over decades. I thought about the credit line that had been running against the household account, the one that had been attached to a card in my name that I had quietly arranged to have transferred to a collections firm the previous week. The timing of that arrangement was not accidental. I had chosen it carefully, the way my father had taught me to choose everything that mattered. The call came at 9:47 on a Friday night. I was in the spare bedroom at Loretta's house, sitting cross-legged on the floor, with Finn asleep against my chest, his small weight warm and steady. his breathing finally, even after what had been a restless evening. I had been reading or trying to read a quarterly filing that Douglas had sent over earlier that afternoon. The numbers blurred after a while. I set the folder aside and simply held my son in the quiet. I had seen the complete filing 3 days earlier in Douglas's office. Every page, every tab. I knew exactly what I was signing and exactly why I was not reading it aloud. When the phone lit up, I almost didn't answer. The name on the screen surprised me. Nadine Harmon. I had not spoken to Donovan's mother since the morning I left the house on Byram Shore Road. We had never been close, not in the way some daughters-in-law describe with warmth and inside jokes and shared recipes. Nadine was a woman who had grown up in a world where appearances were a form of currency, where the right address and the right club membership and the right holiday card were not luxuries but requirements. She had been polite to me, almost always polite, but there had always been a careful distance in it, a politeness that kept its coat on and never quite stayed for dinner. I answered. Celeste. Her voice was different from what I remembered. The sharpness was still there, but underneath it was something else. Something she was working very hard not to let show. Nadine, I said. Finn shifted against me. I pressed my hand lightly to his back. There was a pause. I could hear sound in the background music, the low murmur of voices, the particular acoustic of a large room with high ceilings and too many people trying to be elegant at the same time. We're at Belle Haven, she said. There has been a situation. Belle Haven Club sat on a private peninsula on the western edge of Greenwich, the kind of place where membership was inherited more often than it was applied for. The Harmon family had held their membership for over 30 years. Randolph Harmon, Donovan's father, had joined the year he made partner at his firm, and he had treated the membership ever since as proof of arrival, a physical address for his social standing. The party had been planned for 6 weeks. A late January dinner for 40 guests, a combination of Randolph's business associates and Nadine's social committee from the Greenwich Arts Foundation. White tablecloths, a string quartet, a catered menu from a chef the foundation had used twice before. The kind of evening that was less about celebration and more about maintenance, keeping the right people visible to one another in the right room. What Nadine told me over the phone in carefully controlled sentences that occasionally broke apart and had to be reassembled was this. At 8:15 in the evening, with dinner in its second course and the string quartet midway through a Vivaldi piece, 2 men arrived at the entrance to the private dining room. They were not guests. They had not been invited. There had been 3 written notices before this, letters each sent by certified mail to the Belle Haven address Randolph used for financial correspondence. None had received a response. This was the escalation that followed. They presented themselves to the club's front desk with a document, a formal notice of debt collection, and asked to speak with Randolph Harmon. The club's manager, a composed man named William Ashby, who had handled difficult situations before, had attempted to redirect them. He asked them to wait in the lobby to allow him to pass a message discreetly. The men were not impolite, Nadine told me. They were simply unmovable. By 8:25, Randolph had been quietly informed. He stepped out of the dining room. 3 of his dinner guests noticed. By 8:40, Nadine had followed. By 9 o'clock, the quartet had finished their set, and most of the table had understood in the wordless way that social circles process embarrassment that something had gone wrong. The notice the debt collectors carried was a formal demand for repayment of outstanding balances totaling $680,000. The debt had accumulated across 14 months. Personal credit lines, home renovation contracts, 2 private club charges, and an account at a specialty wine merchant that had apparently been running since the spring of the prior year. Every one of those accounts had been opened under a credit facility that listed Celeste Harmon as the primary account holder. I sat very still on the floor while Nadine explained this. I didn't know, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the word no. I didn't know any of it was in your name. Donovan told his father it was a joint arrangement, that it was organized, that you had agreed. I hadn't, I said. I kept my voice level. Finn's weight was still warm against my chest. No, she said quietly. I'm beginning to understand that. Douglas had known about the credit lines for 3 weeks. When I had first brought him the documentation, The account statements, the authorization signatures, the history of charges that I had gathered quietly over the prior months before anything had broken open. He had reviewed them the same way he reviewed everything without visible reaction, with complete attention. These are co-signed credit facilities, he had explained. Technically, both parties are liable for the outstanding balance, but he had tapped the edge of the folder. The charges were not made by you, and the benefit was not received by you. That's a critical distinction. In Connecticut, when one spouse unilaterally incurs debt for personal or family purposes without the other spouse's knowledge or consent, and the expenditure cannot be demonstrated to have benefited the marital household, the court has discretion to assign sole liability. He had filed a formal motion 3 weeks earlier as part of the broader divorce proceedings to sever Celeste's liability from those accounts. The motion cited the pattern of unauthorized use and attached supporting bank records. What Douglas had not done and what I had deliberately not done was warn Donovan that the credit facilities were about to call in their balances. The original agreements included a standard clause upon the initiation of divorce proceedings. Outstanding balances on jointly held accounts became immediately due. Douglas had filed the divorce paperwork. The filing had, as a matter of legal mechanics, triggered the clause. I had not hidden this from Donovan. His own attorney had received the same paperwork Douglas had filed. If Peter Calloway had reviewed it with the attention it required, he would have seen the clause. He would have advised his client. Whether he had done so, whether Donovan had listened, was not something I had any control over. I had simply not reminded him. What happens now? Nadine asked. That depends on Donovan, I said. Another pause. The background noise on her end had quieted. I imagined her standing somewhere near a window away from the remaining guests, her hand tight around her phone. He's been under a great deal of pressure, she said. There was something in the way she said it that was not quite a defense, more like a woman trying to locate in real time the line between loyalty and honesty. I know he has, I said. I did know. I had watched it accumulate across 3 weeks. The legal filings, the Meridian account freeze, the SEC referral, the board inquiry, Sabrina's arrest, and the liability it attached to his name, and now this. Each development had arrived separately, but they had not been separate. They had been sequential. They had been connected by the choices he had made and the assumptions he had relied upon, and at no point had I manufactured the consequences. I had simply refused to absorb them. Celeste. Nadine's voice had changed again. The control was still there, but something underneath it had shifted. I owe you an apology, not for tonight, for longer than tonight. I did not say anything immediately. I looked down at Finn, at the curve of his ear, at his fingers loosely curled against my collarbone. I appreciate you saying that, I said finally. I mean it, she said. And then before she ended the call, take care of that baby. I held the phone for a long moment after the line went quiet. Outside Loretta's yard was dark and still. The January cold pressed against the windows. I could hear very faintly the furnace running in the basement. There was still one more thing coming. Donovan had survived embarrassment before he was good at it, practiced at the particular Greenwich art of stepping over a mess without appearing to notice it. But embarrassment in a private dining room among 40 guests was one kind of exposure. What was coming the following Thursday was a different kind entirely. I need you to stay with me for this next part. Before I reveal what Celeste did in front of 260 people, drop 260 in the comments. That number will make sense in a moment. This story includes fictional elements added for storytelling purposes. Not everything here is drawn from a single event, but everything it says is something I meant for you to hear. Thursday arrived the way the end of January always does in Connecticut, cold, dense, carrying the particular stillness of a season that is not yet finished with you. Loretta had left a dress on the chair in my room without comment earlier that week. Navy structured, simple in the way of things made without shortcuts. When I asked about it, she said only, "It was your mother's. She wore it to the kind of rooms you'll be walking into Thursday." I did not ask anything further. The Young Entrepreneurs of Fairfield County Annual Gala was held at the Hyatt Regency on East Putnam Avenue in Old Greenwich, a ballroom that seats 260 white linens, winter branch centerpieces, the kind of careful arrangement that costs a great deal to look effortless. Donovan had been nominated 4 consecutive years. He had won twice. The room was full of people who admired him or needed to, or had decided that admiring him was professionally convenient. Winchester Holdings was listed among the evening's Silver Circle sponsors. Loretta had arranged it 6 weeks earlier. I arrived and found my table near the center of the room. Douglas was already inside, standing near the registration desk, a glass of water in his hand. He gave me a single nod. Garrett had messaged at 6:43 in position. DA's office has 2 people here. They're not in evening wear. I put my phone away. Garrett had arranged technical access to the venue's AV system through a contact 2 days earlier. The file was queued and ready. Donovan arrived at 7:15 with Sabrina. He was in the charcoal suit I had picked out with him 3 years ago on Madison Avenue. He was laughing before he reached the door, that particular public laugh, the one that announced his arrival without appearing to try. Several people turned. A man at the bar raised a glass. He did not see me, or if he did, his eyes moved past me the way they move past furniture. That was fine. The program began at 7:45. A welcome, a video reel. The standard preamble an audience endures while finishing appetizers. At 8:17, the projection screen changed. Not to a slide, not to a sponsor logo, to a waveform, the clean visual of an audio recording, and then it began to play. The first clip was 11 seconds. A man's voice, no distortion. The words were specific: a property transfer, an instruction to ensure the wife did not find out about Meridian until after the papers were signed. The date stamp read December 19th. The voice was Donovan Harmon's. The room went silent. Then the second clip began. Agnes Pruitt had started recording on January 5th in-person conversations in the kitchen hallway and home office of the Byram Shore Road property, placed by Winchester Holdings as the legal owner. Under Connecticut law, one-party consent applies to in-person recordings. Agnes was the owner's agent. Every clip was lawful. Douglas had verified it twice. The DA's office had received the full set on January 28th and had not objected to public release. 83 recordings, 14 minutes and 31 seconds. When the final clip ended, the waveform dissolved and was replaced by the Winchester Holdings logo, the small interlocking W my father had drawn on graph paper in 1987, and beneath it in plain type, submitted to the Fairfield County District Attorney's Office, January 28, 2024. The room did not applaud. It did not murmur. 260 people simply sat in the silence of recalibrating everything they had believed about a man they had been prepared to honor. Donovan had turned in his chair, jaw set, calculating. Sabrina's hand was flat on the table. She was staring at the screen. By the time the last clip finished, she was no longer at the table. I did not know when she had left. Douglas reached me before I had fully stood. The board voted this afternoon to suspend him. Calloway received the notice 2 hours ago. I picked up my coat. I had felt many things over the past month. Standing in that ballroom, I felt something quieter than all of them, the specific release of a breath held for a very long time. I walked out into the February cold without looking back. There was still a room at 11 Bruce Place waiting for us, and Donovan, I knew, was already reaching for his phone to call his lawyer. He did not call himself. That told me everything. When a man still believes he has leverage, he calls. When he has stopped believing that and has not yet decided what to believe instead, he sends his lawyer. Calloway called at 11:42. My client would like to request a meeting, he said. Careful, tired, working hard not to let either show. Tonight, if possible, he suggested the Greenwich Police Department, 11 Bruce Place. I almost said something about that, a man proposing a police station as neutral ground after 3 weeks of dismantling everything around him, but I did not. We can be there at 1, I said, then I called Douglas. He was already in the lobby when I arrived at 12:57, leather briefcase in hand, wider than his usual one, the kind that holds more than documents. A detective named Raymond Holt met us at the front desk, checked our identification, and walked us back to a conference room. Not an interrogation room. A conference room with a rectangular table and a wall clock and fluorescent lights that hummed very faintly in the quiet. Donovan was already there, still in the charcoal suit from the gala, tie loosened. He looked like a man who had been handed a problem he was certain he could solve and had been sitting with it for 3 hours discovering that he could not. Calloway sat beside him. Neither of them stood when we entered. Douglas set his briefcase on the table. I sat beside him. Donovan said, "That was a criminal act tonight. The recordings were obtained lawfully," Douglas said, opening his briefcase without looking up. In-person conversations recorded on property owned by Winchester Holdings. The public release was a separate communication protected under the First Amendment. He placed a folder on the table and slid it across. "The legal analysis is in there." Donovan did not look at the folder. "Winchester Holdings," he said. The name sat in his mouth like something he had been turning over for hours. "Who is Winchester Holdings?" Douglas looked at me. I had thought about this moment many times, what I would feel when it finally arrived. Whether there would be something sharp in it, something that needed volume or precision, or the vocabulary of grievance. Sitting across from Donovan Harmon at 1:15 in the morning in a conference room on Bruce Place, what I felt was very close to completion. Not coldness, not triumph. The particular stillness of a long piece of work that is nearly done. "Winchester Holdings was founded by my grandfather in 1961, I said. "My father expanded it over 30 years. I have been the sole beneficial owner since his death 4 years ago." I paused. "You attended his funeral, Donovan. You sat in the third row." Something moved across his face. He looked away. Douglas continued without missing a beat. "Winchester Holdings currently holds assigned debt instruments representing 63% of the outstanding corporate obligations attached to Harmon Capital's 3 primary subsidiary accounts. Acquired through a FINRA-registered broker-dealer between October and December of last year. Fully documented and enforceable under Connecticut commercial law." He removed a second document from the folder. "We are serving formal notice of default tonight. Repayment is due within 30 days. Calloway had gone very still. Detective Holt, standing near the door, cleared his throat. "2 federal agents from the SEC's New York Regional Office have requested a meeting with your client at 9 a.m. tomorrow." He said it without inflection, the way men do when they are delivering information they did not generate and are not responsible for. "I'd recommend getting some rest, Mr. Calloway." Calloway was already writing. I stood and picked up my coat. At the door I stopped, not to look back, but because one thing remained. "You never researched my family," I said. "You were in too much of a hurry to close the deal." I did not wait for an answer. Outside, Bruce Place was empty in the winter dark. Douglas walked me to my car without filling the silence, which was the thing I appreciated most about him in that moment. I drove back to Loretta's house. Finn was asleep. Agnes had left the kitchen light on. I sat down at the table, and for the first time since January 1st, I let myself cry. Not from grief, not from anger, from the particular exhausting relief of a long thing finally almost done. The SEC meeting was at 9. The Stamford courthouse had already been calendared. April in Connecticut arrives without apology. One morning the trees along the Merritt Parkway are still bare, and then, almost overnight, the first green appears tentative. Then suddenly everywhere, as though the season has been waiting off stage and has finally decided it has been patient long enough. I drove to Stamford on a Tuesday morning in the second week of April, with the windows down an inch, and Finn asleep in the back, and I thought about how my father used to say that Connecticut in April was the best argument he knew for staying through its worst months. He had been right about a great many things. Agnes met me on the front steps of 123 Hoyt Street with a travel mug in each hand. She held one out without comment. I took it. "He's been fed," she said. "He'll sleep another 40 minutes. "Thank you, Agnes." She gave me a look that was not quite a smile but was close. "Go do what you came here to do." The Stamford Superior Court Family Division was exactly what courthouses are: functional, slightly tired, built to absorb human difficulty without complaint. Douglas was already inside. We were in the courtroom by 9:15. At the back, 2 men in dark suits sat with the stillness of people present in an official capacity. I had seen that stillness before in a ballroom 2 months earlier. I did not look at them long. Peter Calloway arrived at 9:20. Donovan was not with him. He had filed a written waiver of appearance under Connecticut practice. A party may waive personal attendance at a dissolution hearing if represented by counsel and a separation agreement has already been executed. The agreement had been signed the previous Thursday. Calloway had described it to Douglas over the phone as not his client's preference, but his client's only remaining option. I had not responded to that. It had not required one. The Honorable Patricia Weller presided early 60s, reading glasses on a chain, the efficient manner of someone who has heard every variation of marital dissolution and has long since stopped being surprised. She reviewed the filed agreement, asked Douglas 3 questions about asset valuation, asked Calloway 1 question about the waiver, and then read the terms aloud into the record. I sat with my hands folded and listened to my life being reorganized into legal language. Full physical and legal custody of Finn granted to Celeste Harmon. Donovan retaining supervised visitation, subject to review pending federal proceedings. The Byram Shore Road property confirmed as separate property of Winchester Holdings, excluded from marital assets entirely. Marital liquid assets divided 68% to Celeste, 32% to Donovan, reflecting the court's finding that Donovan had unilaterally dissipated marital assets through the unauthorized Meridian transfer and undisclosed credit obligations. The $680,000 in credit facility debt formally assigned to Donovan. Celeste's liability severed. The Meridian account remaining under federal jurisdiction with Winchester Holdings' civil recovery claim active on a separate docket. Judge Weller signed the decree at 10:47. I did not feel the clean, definitive line I had imagined. What I felt was quieter, the particular stillness of something that has been carried for a long time and is finally carefully set down. Douglas met me on the courthouse steps. The U.S. attorney filed the indictment this morning, he said. Donovan and Sabrina Voss, 11 counts wire fraud, money laundering, tax evasion, offshore structure charges, arrest expected within 72 hours. I looked out at Hoyt Street. A delivery truck double-parked across from the courthouse. A woman passed with a stroller moving quickly with somewhere to be. Calloway knew, I said. He knew this morning, Douglas said. That's why Donovan didn't appear. Agnes was visible through the lobby glass. Finn awake now in her arms, his head turned toward the window light with the alert curiosity he had developed in recent weeks, noticing everything, recording everything. I pushed through the doors and took him, felt his weight settle against my chest the way it always did. We walked out together into the April morning. The light was bright after days of overcast. The trees along Hoyt Street were just beginning to open. It was at last spring. Nadine called that evening. She called at 6:15. I was in the kitchen of the Westport apartment, 2nd floor off Post Road East, close enough to the Saugatuck River that on clear mornings I could see the light moving on the water from the bedroom window. Loretta had helped me find it 3 weeks earlier. She had also, without my asking, arranged the movers. The apartment was not large. 2 bedrooms, white tile, a maple tree outside the kitchen window just beginning to open. Nothing like the house on Byram Shore Road. What it had was something that house never did. It was entirely mine. I had been unpacking a box of books when the phone rang. I'm outside, Nadine said. I looked at Finn and his bouncer on the living room floor, tracking shadows on the ceiling with his usual expression of serious scientific inquiry. Come up, I said. She was in the camel wool coat she had owned for years, a shop on Greenwich Avenue that had since closed. She was carrying a container of soup, the seal-tight kind with a rubber gasket held in both hands. She paused just inside the door, taking in the apartment the way people do when a space tells them something they are still absorbing. The unpacked boxes, the books stacked on the floor, Finn and his bouncer, the maple tree through the kitchen window. Turkey soup, she said. Randolph always likes it too thick, so I make extra. Thank you, I said. Sit down, Nadine. She sat at the small kitchen table, still in her coat. I put the soup on the stove and did not say anything while the apartment adjusted to having her in it. I had thought for most of my marriage that Nadine simply did not like me. Too quiet at the events that required animation. Too detached at the dinners that required warmth. I had taken it personally, the way you do when you are 27 and newly married, and still learning the grammar of the family you have entered. What I understood now, standing at the stove with her at my kitchen table, was that Nadine had not disliked me. She had been afraid of what I represented, a woman who looked at her son carefully enough to see past the performance of him. That was not a comfortable thing for a mother to invite close. He was arrested this morning, she said. I had known. Douglas had messaged at 9:17, 2 sentences clean and factual. But hearing it in Nadine's voice in my kitchen with the soup warming on the stove made it something different from what it had been on a screen. I know, I said, Sabrina as well. She said the name with a flatness that was not anger and not satisfaction. Simply the flatness of a word spoken too many times recently to carry much charge anymore. I brought Finn over and placed him in her arms. She held him the way grandmothers hold babies when they are finally permitted to, with a carefulness that has nothing to do with inexperience, and everything to do with understanding the weight of being trusted with something that matters. We ate the soup. It was good, the kind built from long familiarity, every component adjusted over years into something irreplaceably itself. We talked carefully the way two people do when they have a great deal of history and are choosing deliberately which parts to carry forward. At the door she stopped. I should have seen it sooner, she said. What he was doing and what it was costing you. She held my gaze. I'm not asking you to forgive me tonight. I'm asking if there's room eventually to try. I thought about every room I had been in over the past 4 months. The kitchen floor at 5 a.m., Loretta's study, Douglas's office, the conference room at 11 Bruce Place, the courtroom at 123 Hoyt Street, and this one. A small kitchen in Westport, a maple tree in the window, a woman at the door trying in the only way she knew to begin again. There's room, I said. She nodded once, left. I stood at the window long after her car pulled away, watching the last April light fade from the maple tree. Finn slept in the next room. The Saugatuck River was somewhere nearby in the dark, moving the way rivers do continuously without requiring anyone to notice. There was still one room ahead. Fluorescent lights, a visitor's log, a man sitting across a bolted table. I knew what I would say when I got there. January came back. It always does. Finn turned 11 months on the 4th. He was not yet walking, but he was close, pulling himself up against every available surface, testing the space between his hands and the next solid thing with an expression of furious concentration that I had begun to recognize as entirely his own. He had my father's eyes, dark and steady and slightly too serious for his age. I had requested the visit in December. FC. I Danbury sits on Route 37, 45 minutes from Westport on a clear morning. I left at 8:15 with Finn in his car seat holding the small wooden ring that Loretta had given him, his current preferred object examined from every angle, never set down for long. I did not bring anyone with me. This was not a visit that required company. I signed in at the front desk, surrendered my phone and bag, accepted a visitor badge. A corrections officer walked us through 2 secured doors into the visiting room. Fluorescent lights round tables, bolted to the floor. Plastic chairs, the faint smell of industrial cleaner and old coffee. Exactly the room I had been carrying in my mind since April. I sat down, I waited. Donovan came through the far door 4 minutes later. He had lost weight. The particular ease he had always carried, the physical confidence of a man accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room, was different now. Not gone, recalibrated. The body of someone who has spent a year sitting with the distance between who he believed he was and who the evidence proved him to be. He saw Finn first. Something crossed his face before he reached the table, brief, unguarded, and gone before he sat down. I did not try to name it. I had spent 4 months reading Donovan Harmon carefully, and I had learned that some spaces in a person are not mine to interpret. He sat across from us. He looked at Finn. He's bigger, he said. 11 months, I said. Finn studied him with the same level attention he gave to everything new. Then he held out the wooden ring, his gesture of provisional acceptance. Donovan took it, held it for a moment, handed it back. Thank you for coming, he said, simply without performance. I had not prepared a speech. I had simply come knowing what needed to be said. I came because Finn has a right to know his father exists, I said. Not the court record, not the story, just that you are real and present in the world, even here. That is why I came. I paused. And because there is one thing I need you to understand, not for my sake, but for yours. You looked at me for 4 years and saw a woman who was manageable, quiet, someone who would absorb what was given to her and produce no consequences. I held his gaze. I was never that woman. I was always Gerald Winchester's daughter. I had been paying attention the entire time. You chose not to know me. That was the only mistake that all the others came from. Donovan was quiet for a long moment. I know that now, he said. I know you do, I said. That's why I could say it. I stood at 10:43. He looked at Finn one last time. Is he healthy? He asked. He's very healthy, I said. I walked out through the secured doors, collected my things, buckled Finn into his seat. He slept the entire drive back down Route 37, the wooden ring still in his hand. My father's letter had ended with one sentence. I had not quoted it to anyone. I had simply lived it. A woman who knows her own worth does not argue it. She demonstrates it. And then she goes home. I went home. To every woman reading this, who has ever sat on a cold floor at 5 in the morning, holding something precious, listening to a door open that should have stayed closed. You are not defeated, you are thinking. The door opening is not the end. Sometimes it is the first thing that has to happen before everything else can begin. Summer in Westport arrives without permission. One week the mornings are still cool enough to require a jacket. And then one day you step outside and the air is different, heavier, warmer, carrying the particular smell of cut grass and river water and something flowering along the fence line that I have not yet learned the name of. I had spent my first winter in this apartment learning its drafts and its sounds, the way the radiator clicked at 2 in the morning, and the way the maple tree outside the kitchen window held its branches when the wind came off the Saugatuck River. By July, I knew the apartment, the way you know a place you have decided to keep. Not the familiarity of someone passing through. The deeper kind. The kind that means you have chosen it back. Finn took his first steps on a Wednesday afternoon in the second week of July. He had been working toward it for weeks, pulling himself upright against the coffee table, testing the space between one hand and the next surface, letting go for half a second, and then grabbing back with the focused grip of someone who is not yet ready, but is running out of patience with not being ready. I had watched him practice the way you watch something you cannot hurry, with your hands at your sides, with your breath held just slightly. He did not take those first steps toward me. He took them toward Loretta. She was sitting in the armchair near the window with her reading glasses on and a quarterly filing open in her lap, some piece of work she had brought over from the desk in her car, and was finishing without apology, the way she finished everything with complete attention and no unnecessary commentary. Finn had pulled himself up against the edge of the coffee table, looked across the 4 feet of open space between himself and the armchair, and simply decided. 4 steps, each one a small, separate decision, his arms out at his sides for balance, his face set with the concentration he brings to anything he has not done before. He reached the armchair and grabbed Loretta's knee with both hands and looked up at her. She looked at him over her reading glasses. Well, she said, it's about time. I was standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel in my hands, and I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have been adequate, and I knew it. I pressed one hand flat against the doorframe and held it there, the wood solid and warm beneath my palm, and I let myself feel for a full, unguarded moment everything that had been building since a January morning on a kitchen floor in Greenwich. Relief. Something that is not quite grief but lives in the same neighborhood. Love so specific it does not have a general word, and underneath all of it, quieter than the rest, the particular satisfaction of having been somewhere very dark and having found your way through it without losing the thing you most needed to carry. Finn looked over at me, then from Loretta's knee, still holding on with both hands. He smiled the way he smiles without reservation with his whole face, as though he has not yet learned to give anything partially. I smiled back. Douglas had called in May with the final numbers on the Meridian recovery. The federal forfeiture proceedings had concluded in April, and Winchester Holdings' restitution claim had been honored in full, $4,200,000, returned to the Harmon Capital corporate accounts from which Donovan had taken it with Winchester, holding first priority on repayment against the 63% debt position that had been quietly assembled between October and December of the previous year. 3 separate legal tracks, 14 months. Douglas had delivered the summary in 2 sentences over the phone, the way he delivered everything without drama, without editorializing, as though the outcome were simply the natural result of the work which it was. I had thanked him. He had said that my father would have found the entire structure quite elegant. Then he had wished me a good summer and ended the call. I stood at the kitchen window for a long time afterward, watching the maple tree, thinking about my father sitting at a desk somewhere in 1987, drawing an interlocking W on a sheet of graph paper. Imagining, in whatever way fathers allow themselves to imagine such things, the world his daughter would one day need to be equipped for. He had built her the tools before she knew she would need them. That was the real gift. Not the properties, not the legal architecture, not the numbers in the quarterly filings. The belief expressed through 30 years of careful and patient work that his daughter was worth preparing for. That what she would face was something she could handle if she had been given the right foundation. He had been right about the foundation. I had done the rest. Agnes came on Thursdays, as she had since February, regular as weather. She brought food in containers that stacked efficiently, and she moved through the apartment with the calm of a woman who has decided her presence here is permanent and does not require ongoing discussion. She had begun in recent months sitting with Finn on the living room floor and teaching him the names of things, holding up objects, saying the word clearly, and once waiting for him to try it. He had managed something approaching light 3 weeks ago and had been so pleased with himself that he had said it 17 more times before dinner. Agnes had recorded this without expression and informed me at the door on her way out that he was, in her professional opinion, exceptionally attentive. I had told her I already knew that. Nadine came on Sunday afternoons. Not every Sunday, perhaps 2 out of 4. She called first always. She brought things, food or a book, or once a small, carved wooden animal she had found at a shop on Greenwich Avenue that Finn had immediately attempted to take apart with his fingers with the focused scientific interest that he applied to everything structural. She and I ate together and talked carefully the way two people talk when they have a shared history and are choosing each time which parts of it to bring into the room and which to leave outside. We were not close in the easy way. We were close in the deliberate way, which is harder, and I have come to believe more honest. She showed up. I let her in. Each time we both chose it again. There is a kind of relationship that only exists because both people keep deciding to continue it, and I have found that those are sometimes the ones that hold. Randolph had not come. I had not expected him to, and I had made my peace with that expectation. Not every door needs to be opened. Not every person finds their way to the version of themselves that is capable of the kind of accounting that situation required. That was his work to do or not do. It was not mine to manage. There are things you learn in the year after everything breaks open. You learn that stillness is not the same as surrender. That the woman who sits quietly on a kitchen floor at 5 in the morning holding her child, not crying, not begging, is not passive. She is gathering. She is reading the room. She is doing the thing that is actually the most difficult of all the available options. She is waiting until she knows enough to move well. You learn that the tools you need are almost never the obvious ones. They are not volume or anger or the dramatic gesture. They are patience and documentation, and the willingness to sit with difficulty longer than anyone around you thinks is reasonable. They are the habit of writing things down, the habit of watching, the knowledge in your bones of what you are actually worth, not what you have been told, not what the person across the table is currently insisting, but what you know from the inside, from the work you have done and the things you have kept intact through pressure. You learn that a child watching from a bouncer seat on the living room floor at 5 in the morning is recording everything. Not just what you say. What you do when you think no one who matters is watching. What you do when the door opens and the cold comes in and the champagne cork pops and the world as you understood it rearranges itself in the space of 10 minutes. He is watching. He is taking notes in whatever language children take notes before they have words. And the life you build in the months that follow is the answer you are giving him. Finn let go of Loretta's knee that afternoon and walked back toward me. 5 steps this time, then 6. His arms still out, his face still entirely focused, his whole body committed to the mechanics of forward motion. He reached me and grabbed my hand. I crouched down to his level, eye to eye. His father's eyes in a face that was entirely his own, dark, steady, carrying more intelligence than any 11-month-old has any business carrying. "I've got you," I said. The same words I had said in the car on Byram Shore Road, in the fog at 5:30 in the morning, on the first day of January, when I did not yet know what any of it would become. When the only thing I was certain of was that I was moving forward, and I was taking him with me. He looked at me for a moment, then he let go of my hand, and walked away on his own. That is, I think, exactly what it is supposed to look like. Not the holding on. The letting go when the time is right in the right direction with enough ground already built beneath you that the next step is possible. If you are sitting in your own version of that kitchen floor tonight, your own cold January, your own unanswered calls, your own door opening in the dark, I am not going to promise you that what comes next will be easy. I know better than that now. What I will tell you is this: you are not what happened to you this morning. You are what you do with the one that comes after. I have thought about what I would say if I could go back to the woman sitting on that kitchen floor at 5 in the morning, cold marble dead phone, a newborn on her chest, a door opening in the dark. I would tell her, don't wait as long as I did. I stayed silent through too many small surrenders. I told myself patience was strength, and sometimes it was. But sometimes it was just fear wearing a quieter name. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. Knowing your worth is not the same as protecting it. You have to do both. I believe God does not place you in a valley to break you. He places you there so you learn finally what you are made of. I found that out on the coldest morning of my life. I wish I had found it sooner. My personal belief. A woman who understands her own value does not need to raise her voice. She simply stops making herself small. That is not revenge. That is just finally being honest. If you are walking through your own version of this story right now, a silent marriage, a financial trap, a life that was built around someone who never saw you clearly, I hope something here stayed with you. Drop a comment below and tell me which part of this story hit closest to home. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to read today. And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, then subscribe so you never miss what comes next. A small but important note: the stories on this channel contain fictional elements crafted with the sole purpose of education and reflection. If this type of content is not for you, no hard feelings, there is something out there made exactly for you. Go find it. And to everyone who stayed until the very end, thank you, truly. It means more than you know.